It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and here to talk to us about adoption is Heidi Meier. Thanks for being here, Heidi.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kyle.
I love this because we've talked about adoption before here, but I haven't really talked to somebody who has been adopted about their experience, and excited to hear about that. But you are not only have been adopted, but also you have adopted yourself. You didn't adopt yourself, but you adopted children.
Yes, that is right.
So let's go back to your being adopted.
Sure.
When did you first learn that you were adopted?
So I first learned I was adopted probably when I was a toddler. My mother says she told me when I was 2, but they just were always really open about it. So I knew at a very early age that I was adopted, partially because I got a brother. And I recognized that my mother wasn't pregnant. Like, she didn't have a big belly like everybody else.
How old was that?
I was like 3 when they brought him home. Yeah. And my parents would say, oh, well, we've got, here's your baby brother. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I had cousins, and aunts and uncles that were pregnant. So I was kind of like, all right, well, okay, where did he come from? So yeah, I knew very early on, and they were always really positive about it. I knew that my parents couldn't have children. My mom suffered some infertility, so she was very open about that, and they just always spoke very highly of adoption. They're like, we wanted to be parents, and we waited so long for you, and we're just so lucky to have you. I mean, they never made it seem like I was lucky to have them. It was like, we're just so lucky that we got to be blessed with you. Yeah. So I never really felt any different. So people always ask that. They're like, well, what does it feel like to be adopted? And I didn't know any different. So, maybe it's challenging sometimes when there's mixed families with like biological children and adopted children. But my parents, we had like this typical middle class. My mom stayed home. My dad worked. There were fresh baked cookies all the time. And my bed was made. So I had this great life. I was able to go to college. So
was there ever a time that you kind of questioned things and maybe even got upset that you were adopted? Or was it always something that you accepted and this is just the way it is and you're happy?
I loved being adopted. Okay. It was always this, I think I always questioned it, right? Because you're a teenager and everybody hates their mom for a little bit, or at least as a teenage girl you do. So I'd get in trouble and I'd go to my room and I would say under my breath, you're not my mom, you're not my real mom.
Right.
But she absolutely is. But I would always have, as little girls do, we have Barbies and soap operas, and I was a writer, so I would create this like other life, I guess, that I maybe had. And was I a English princess? I don't know. I could be. So you kind of think that like, what could my life be, or who do I look like? So that's what I always wanted to know. Like, whose nose do I have, and is she thinking about me? I think those were things that went through my head. And I knew on my birthday that she had to be thinking of me. So it was like the one day where you're like, hey, birth mom in the universe, I know we're connected. But no, I just, except for like the medical stuff, right? Because you don't know. So every time you go to the doctor and they're
history.
Like, yeah, hey, do you have a history of asthma? I don't know.
Huh.
And you just keep writing it over and over. And especially now, like, hey, you're a woman. Do you have a history of breast cancer? I don't know. That was the only time where I'd be like, oh, yeah, I'm adopted. That's different.
Yeah.
So.
And we kind of spoiled the fact that you did adopt children on your own. Was that something that was kind of in the back of your mind growing up? Is like, oh, I'm adopted. I would like to adopt children as well.
It actually was. So I kind of thought like, I would love to adopt a child, not really knowing what that fully entailed, or, hey, I kind of have to have a husband to do this too. So I never, I'll just do it. I'll just tell him that's what we're doing and we'll go with it. So I unfortunately, found out that infertility, that's my cross. So that's, what God gave me to say, like, hey, your baby making oven doesn't work right, and this is where I need you to go. So I think once that initially hit, you're like, oh, well, now I have to adopt if I want to be a parent, because there's just no other way. So I was really, really on board with it. I was like, all right, adoption, not going to do any crazy tests or surgeries or, whatever. And my husband was like, oh, that's what it is. And so I think there's this process of you accepting what your path is. You know, you can't have what you want, and it's not your plan, it's God's plan. Right. And do I want to be a parent, or do I just want to get pregnant? Do I just want to go to the ends of the earth to create a life inside me, or do I want to see what God has for me?
So your plan, which you said is not the plan, but would have been have biological children and then look into adoption later? Yeah.
Yeah, go to China.
Yeah.
Get a baby. I was always obsessed with that. I don't know why. But that was different.
Explain that. You were obsessed with going to China and getting a baby.
Yeah, I have a very different view on international adoption now. But at the time, I was like, these little Asian babies are so adorable and cute. Uh-huh. I just think it would be great to adopt and like go over to the country and go to an orphanage. I think the orphanage was probably in my head like, oh gosh, this is just an awful feeling for a child to have, and I don't want a child to be in an orphanage. Yeah. That's probably where that came from.
But that's not what you ended up doing for adoption.
No. So that was originally, we thought about it. So I've probably been to every adoption agency in the state of Indiana and looked at international adoption as well. And so at the time, things have really changed in international adoption, fortunately and unfortunately. But China doesn't value life. So they've made several changes and kind of made it more difficult to adopt that route. It's also illegal to place your baby for adoption in China. So you don't get very much information, and a baby's pretty much abandoned somewhere. And they're toddlers. So you're going to get a baby that speaks a different language than you, could have developmental delays, different things like that. And you're waiting a long time. So at that time, it was like you could wait 7 years, pay $40,000 and still be on a list. So that we just decided wasn't probably the best route for us.
So you decide that you are going to look into adoption. What was the process for that? So
I'm just a big researcher. I don't know, just Google's my friend, and let's go in here and talk to people. And we looked at several different agencies, and what was important, what we learned was, initially I was not okay with open adoption because my own adoption was closed. And I'm like, open adoption means co-parenting, and that's not what I want to do. I want to be in control.
Can you explain that, open adoption versus closed adoption?
Sure. So closed adoption is when the records are sealed, birth family and adoptive family do not know each other, don't know their identities, and adoptee grows up not knowing anything about the birth family or having any contact or communication. Where open adoption, there's really no legal term, which is what we do now. Open adoption is adoptive family meets birth family, even before, most of the time, even before baby is born. And then you have to be open about what your openness is. So if birth mom says, I want to see my baby 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a year.
Oh, wow.
Or I just want pictures and letters, then are you open to that? And by visits, we don't mean that baby goes and stays the night. Birth family doesn't pick them up for the weekend. It's not like that. So you go and spend time, whether it's, with my second son, we go to the zoo, we go out to eat, we go to the park, we spend a day, and he gets to know his family, and she gets to see him, because birth mom has 2 questions. Is my baby safe?
Yeah.
And is he going to hate me? Because I had to make this choice for him.
Right.
So I always say it's my job to do those 2 things. I'm going to keep your baby safe, and I'm going to do everything in my power so that he knows you do not hate him.
Right.
That is, or he doesn't hate you. Yeah. So that's what openness is. And I'll be honest, a lot of adoptive parents are afraid. They're fearful of that.
And you were?
Yeah, initially I was like, I don't even know what this means. But the more that I learned and researched agencies, I wanted one that was going to be open, because that's the best thing for the adoption triad, for the adoptee, the birth family, and then also the adoptive parents. And it's a lot of dying to yourself, because you want to be in control. You want to have this child. You want to do everything and anything you want. But in reality, our children aren't really ever our children. They're God's. Yeah. So you really learn that in adoption. Like, this child is going to know. And so all my decisions are based on my child. And it is really hard sometimes because I am frustrated. It's messy. I'm angry at the birth parents. I'm like, what are you doing today? But at the end of the day, or 18 years from now, my sons are going to look at me and say, well, why didn't you share these things? Why didn't you do those things? And that's going to be back on me. So I want them to have that opportunity to know their birth families, good, bad, or ugly. That's what they are. And you do it in a safe way, of course, but and we do not have easy adoptions. I'll be honest, they're not easy. But.
Yeah. We're talking with Heidi Meier about adoption, and I feel like we could talk for hours on this, but maybe just before we go, maybe any suggestions, tips, or advice or encouragement that you might have for some different categories. So for somebody who is considering adoption, what would you say?
I would say be open as possible, because it's really all about God's plan. And I was afraid of drugs. We do drugs in Indiana. Meaning
you were afraid of adopting a child
that was dependent.
Was using drugs.
Was using drugs. Yeah. You have to be comfortable, but you're never going to find all the perfect answers. There's no study that says we've taken this child and studied them in utero to 18, and this is how they've been with cocaine or methadone or heroin, whatever. But you've got to be open to that. You should also ask yourself if you're open to race and color. So we're not just talking about biracial. We're talking about if you can be open to biracial, you need to just be open to a completely different race. And that's a completely different journey, because now you're responsible. Just like if we went to China, I'm responsible for teaching my child that culture, because the world will see my African American son as African American, but inside he's a Caucasian white boy. So, you have to be willing to say, race is race. Are we willing to go that route with him? But just be open and tell people, that's something that I meet adoptive couples and I'm like, I didn't know you were interested in adopting, because the adoption world is really very small. And there's birth moms or expectant moms that will say, I'm thinking about this, or so-and-so will contact so-and-so. And that's all it takes is that phone call to say, I have a couple that's waiting. Are you interested? So be open, talk about it, share your story. You don't have to share all your infertility deal if you don't want to, but I think it helps people. Especially, I read this great article that talked about how abortion hurts women that have had miscarriages, because it basically takes away that baby was ever a real baby. So nobody talks about their miscarriages either. Who wants to talk about that? But I say talk about it, because you're not alone. We're not in this alone. So that's my take for people that are wanting to adopt. Talk about it, be open, research, ask questions to your agency, and love that birth family as much as you can.
And then suggestions for those of us who might be interacting with adoptive families, who have children that play with adopted children. What advice or tips would you have for us?
I like to say, it's just as normal as can be, Again, be open and asking those, because we know our kids are adopted. We have, my son's African American, so that's pretty blatant when you have two white parents. Just don't be afraid about being politically correct. Just say, hey, are your kids adopted? Like, I'd love to hear your story. Do you want to share? And they may not. Some adoptive parents are like, that's my child's story, and I want to leave it up to them to share. I'm pretty open about sharing it, because I think people need to know, and adoption needs to get better and change. But I would just listen, and if you have questions, ask them about the process, and then ask them what they do for their birth family. Like, what does open adoption look like to you? Because I think there's that stigma about open adoption, and I get a lot of people that say, oh gosh, you don't want anything to do with them, right? Like, she did drugs or she did this. Like, you don't want your kid to know that, right? And I'm like, well, that's his family. And even we're not perfect, So am I going to sit down and tell him at 5 some of these things? No. But it's just helpful for everybody overall that we encourage a positive, open relationship with the birth family.
All right. Well, this has been great. I appreciate you sharing your journey, both as being adopted and as adopting children also. And any resources that you might suggest that people, websites, if somebody's curious or looking for some resources?
Yeah. So I would, if you are an adoptee, especially in Indiana, we talked a little bit before the show about the law changing. I would definitely check out Indiana Adoptee Network. That's a Facebook page. You can get resources for that. I'm a little leery of like all the groups, I guess, on Facebook because there can be just a lot of confusion. But I would search out kind of other adoptive families, but just be open and always be cautious of what you're looking at, what you're kind of committing yourself to, because sometimes it's just all about the wrong stuff when it should really be focused on your child.
And I like what you said, they're kind of in the middle of this being open to God's plan and realizing that, and not to get so focused on what our plan is, because that never tends to work out the way we think it will or should. Yeah. Should it?
It's a constant dying to self. And your kid just wants a parent that loves them at the end of the day. And if you're doing that, I mean, if you're a parent, you're going to fail. I mean, that's just, you are. So I think it's learning that, like, oh gosh, I want to make them not feel adopted, but they are adopted. Like, I don't want to hide that, but I want that,
Yeah.
And it's just all about focusing in on that love and what we can share for everybody. At the end of the day, they got two wonderful families that love them.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, thank you again for sharing some of your journey, Heidi. I appreciate it.
It's great to be here.